I died twice before I understood anything. The first time, my sister smiled while she watched. The second time, I was born again with every memory intact, and a debt she would pay in full. I died on a Wednesday. The marble stairs were cold under my back. My skull had cracked against the third step from the bottom. Blood pooled beneath my hair, warm at first, then cooling fast into a dark halo on white stone. I remember the chandelier above me, spinning slow, its crystal teeth catching the light. I remember Camille's shoes. Black patent leather, sharp heels, standing very still at the top of the staircase. She didn't scream. She didn't call for help. She just watched me die. The way you watch water go down a drain. There was one thing Camille didn't know that night. I'll get to that later. I woke up gasping, lungs full of air that didn't smell like copper and dust. Sunlight came through a window I hadn't seen in years. The sheets under my hands were rough cotton, not silk. Somewhere below, a rooster crowed, and a kettle whistled thin and shrill. My hands were young again, no scars, no calluses, no wedding ring I never got to wear. I sat up so fast my head spun. I knew this room. I knew this morning. This was 3 years before I died. My chest still ached where the fall had broken me, except it hadn't happened yet. Not in this body. Not in this life. I pressed my palm flat against the mattress and felt the seams of the quilt my mother sewed. The smell of wood smoke drifted up from the kitchen. Somewhere outside, gravel crunched under tires. A car was arriving early. That detail would matter later. Though I didn't know it yet. I had exactly one advantage now. I remembered everything Camille would do. And everything she would become. I remembered every lie Julian Voss would tell me with that same patient, generous smile. I remembered the name of the man who actually owned him, a name that made bank managers go quiet and made federal agents change the subject. Last time, I found the offshore account 2 days after I died. This time, I already knew where to look, and I hadn't even gotten dressed yet. This time, I decided, I would not fight for anything Camille wanted. I would hand it to her. Wrapped in a bow. Because I finally understood what she never bothered to check before she took things, what was actually inside. I heard footsteps on the staircase outside my door, light and quick. That laugh followed a half-second later, bright as a bell and just as hollow. Camille. She swung my door open without knocking, the way she always did, like the house and everything in it already belonged to her. Her hair was still dark then, not the honey blonde she'd dye it for Julian later. She wore our mother's old perfume, roses gone slightly sweet and rotten underneath, and it hit me like a slap before she said a single word. "You're finally up," she said. "Dad wants us downstairs. Some man from the bank is here." "This early?" I said. "Apparently your inheritance can't wait for breakfast," she said, and smiled the way she always smiled right before she took something. I should have known then. I should have laughed at how little had changed. Downstairs, the man from the bank was already seated at our kitchen table. Briefcase open, papers fanned across the wood like a losing hand of cards. My father sat across from him, gray at the temples, hands folded too tightly. Camille slid into the chair beside him. I stayed standing by the door, arms crossed, watching the room the way I used to watch it from the top of a staircase. Falling. "Your father's textile business has an opportunity," the banker said. "A merger. Substantial capital. But it requires signatures from both daughters, given the trust structure." Camille's eyes lit up before he even finished the sentence. "Money did that to her. It always had." "How substantial?" she asked. The banker named a number that used to make my hands shake. This time I just watched Camille's face instead, the way her mouth curved like she'd already spent it. That was villain escalation number 1, though nobody in that kitchen would have called it that. Camille didn't ask if the merger was safe. She didn't ask who the buyer was. She asked how fast the check would clear and whether she'd get her half before mine. My father looked at me, waiting. In my past life, I fought her for every inch of that company. I hired the lawyer. I flew to the offices. I lost anyway. Because Camille always had Julian whispering in her ear by then, and Julian always had men behind him who didn't lose. This time, I smiled instead. "Take my share," I told her. "I don't want it." The kitchen went silent except for the kettle, still ticking as it cooled. Camille blinked at me like I'd spoken a foreign language. "You're joking," she said. "I'm not." She studied my face for a trap, the way a cat studies a hole it's about to reach into. I let her look as long as she wanted. She wouldn't find anything, because I'd learned something in death that I never understood in life. The best traps don't look like traps. They look like gifts nobody else was foolish enough to want. "Fine," Camille said, already reaching for the pen. "More for me. I want you to remember that word. Fine." It would matter more than she knew. That merger papers she signed that morning weren't clean. I knew that the way you know your own scar tissue. From the inside out. 3 years from the moment she died, in my old life, I learned the buyer behind that merger wasn't a company at all. It was a shell for men who moved money for people who hurt other people for a living. My father never knew. He died believing he'd saved the business. Camille never asked, because Camille never asked questions that might slow down a check. The banker left an hour later, briefcase lighter, Camille's signature drying on 3 separate pages. I watched her practically skip up the stairs afterward, humming something off-key, rose perfume trailing behind her like smoke off a fire nobody had noticed yet. I went to the phone in the hallway instead. Just one call. To a number I had memorized in a life that hadn't happened yet. Reyes and Cole, attorneys at law, a woman's voice answered. "I need to speak with Marcus Reyes," I said. "Tell him it's about the Voss account. Tell him I have information he'll want before anyone else does." There was a pause on the line, papers shuffling somewhere far away. "And your name?" the woman asked. "Elena Marsh," I said. "He doesn't know me yet." "He will." I hung up before she could ask anything else. My hands weren't shaking anymore. Not the way they used to shake in the last life, back when I found out everything too late to matter. 3 days later, the contract's window for buyer withdrawal would close for good. After that, whoever was behind that merger would own a piece of everything my father built, permanently, no questions asked, no way back. Camille didn't know the clock was running. I did. I'd read the fine print in another life, in a lawyer's office that smelled like burnt coffee, 2 weeks after they buried me. That evening, Camille found me on the porch, watching the sun go down orange and low behind the fields. "You could have fought me for it," she said, leaning on the railing. "Why didn't you?" I looked at her for a long moment. "Rose and rot. All over again. Because you always wanted things you didn't understand," I said. "I'm tired of explaining them to you." She laughed, short and sharp, the way she always laughed when she thought she'd won. Poor Elena. Always so dramatic. She didn't see the man in the gray sedan parked at the end of our road, watching the house with a patience that had nothing to do with curiosity. I did. I'd seen a car like that once before, the week before I died, and I never forgot the man behind the wheel. I knew exactly who had sent him. I didn't tell her. I didn't tell anyone. Some knowledge you keep, like a knife in a coat pocket, until the moment it's needed. That night I sat at my desk with a single sheet of paper and wrote down every name I remembered from my old life, every ally, every enemy, every date that would matter before this was over. I wrote Julian Voss at the top and circled it twice. He hadn't even walked into our lives yet. He would, in 11 days. Wearing sandalwood cologne and a smile built for cameras. I already knew what waited underneath both. Camille thought she'd won something that morning. She had no idea what she'd actually agreed to carry. 11 days later, a black car came up our gravel drive, engine purring low and expensive. I watched it from my bedroom window, heart steady, jaw tight. Camille was already outside on the porch, hair curled, perfume reapplied, practically vibrating with anticipation before the driver's door had even opened. I remembered this moment from another life. I remembered how it ended. This time, I intended to make sure it ended very differently for her. The car door opened. A man stepped out into the late afternoon light, tall, composed, dressed like money that had never once been questioned. Camille's breath caught audibly, even from where I stood. I felt nothing but a cold, familiar recognition, the kind you feel walking past a grave with your own name on it. "Julian Voss," I whispered to the empty room. "Right on schedule. Downstairs, the front door opened, and I heard Camille's voice turn syrup sweet, welcoming in the very thing that would eventually help kill me if I let it happen the same way twice. I had no intention of letting it happen the same way twice. I went downstairs slowly, one hand trailing the banister, remembering exactly how it had felt to fall down these same stairs in another version of this life. My reflection passed in the hallway mirror, calm, composed, smiling faintly at nothing at all. Camille didn't notice the smile. She was too busy staring at Julian like he'd hung the moon himself. "Mr. Voss," my father said, shaking his hand. "We weren't expecting the merger's lead investor in person." "Call me Julian," he said. His voice was smooth, unhurried, built for boardrooms. "I like to meet the families behind the businesses I invest in. Numbers only tell half the story." Sandalwood cologne rolled off him in the entryway, warm and expensive. It hit me like a fist to the chest. In my old life, that same scent used to mean safety. Now it just meant I was standing 3 feet from the man who helped end me. Camille stepped forward before anyone could stop her. "Camille Marsh," she said, offering her hand a beat too eagerly. "I signed the papers myself. I wanted this deal to happen." "I know," Julian said, and smiled at her the exact way he used to smile at me. Ambition like that doesn't go unnoticed. I watched her flush with the compliment, chin lifting, shoulders squaring like she'd already won something bigger than a business deal. She had no idea he said that to everyone. He'd said it to me once, in another life, in a hotel bar that smelled like gin and cedar. I remembered how warm it had felt to be chosen. I remembered how cold it felt to find out why. "And you must be Elena," Julian said, turning to me, hand extended. I shook it once, briefly, and let go before the warmth could linger. "I am," I said. "I hope the merger treats my sister well. She worked very hard to get it." Something flickered behind his eyes, quick and assessing, gone before Camille could catch it. Men like Julian noticed when someone didn't fall for the charm. I wanted him to notice. I wanted him wondering about me from day one, the way I'd spent 3 years wondering about him too late. "You're not interested in the business yourself?" he asked. "I have other plans," I said. "Smaller ones. Quieter ones." Camille laughed, sharp and dismissive. "Elena likes to play humble. She could have had half of everything. She just didn't want the responsibility." "Is that so?" Julian said, watching me a second too long before he turned back to her. That was the second thing I noticed that afternoon, though I didn't say it out loud. Julian Voss didn't fully believe her. Not yet. Men who lie for a living recognize honesty as a shape they don't trust, even when it's aimed somewhere else. They sat in the front room for an hour, going over terms Camille barely understood and didn't ask about. I stayed at the edge of the conversation, pouring tea nobody drank, listening for every detail I already half remembered and needed to hear again anyway. Numbers. Dates. A holding company registered somewhere with looser laws than ours, a closing date exactly 30 days out. 30 days. That was the new clock, ticking louder than the one before it. When Julian finally left, his car pulling away down the gravel drive, Camille turned to me glowing, practically breathless. "He's perfect," she said. "Rich, polite, interested in me. What more could I want?" "The truth," I said quietly, eventually. "What does that mean?" "Nothing," I said. "Enjoy your evening, Camille." I went back upstairs and sat at the same desk, adding 2 new names to my list, and 1 new date circled twice in red ink. 30 days until the merger closed for good. 30 days until Julian Voss expected to own a piece of everything my father had built, quietly, permanently, with my sister's signature holding the whole thing together like a knot she didn't know she'd tied around her own throat. I picked up the phone again that night. Once the house had gone dark and quiet. I dialed a second number. One I hadn't used yet in this life, and waited through 3 rings before someone picked up. "It's me," I said, when the voice on the other end answered. "It's starting exactly the way I told you it would. I need everything ready before day 30. Not day 31. Day 30. The voice on the other end asked a question I didn't answer directly. I only said one thing back. "Trust me. I've already watched this happen once. This time, I'm the one setting the trap." I hung up and sat in the dark for a long while, listening to Camille laugh on the phone in her own room down the hall, already telling some friend about the handsome investor who'd walked into her life like a gift. She had no idea what she was actually holding. She wouldn't. Not for weeks. She would find out. Just not yet. The engagement party happened 4 days later, faster than even I expected. Camille wanted a celebration before the merger closed, something loud enough to announce her new life to everyone who'd ever doubted her. The ballroom smelled like lilies and champagne, sweet and slightly sickening under the chandelier light. Waiters moved in black and white, trays chiming softly with crystal glasses. Camille wore a dress the color of fresh blood, diamonds at her throat that Julian had bought her that morning. She glowed under the light, laughing too loud, touching his arm every few seconds like she needed proof he was real. To new beginnings, Julian said, raising his glass to the room. And to family, old and new. Everyone drank. I lifted my glass and didn't swallow a single drop. Camille found me near the windows an hour later, cheeks flushed with champagne and triumph. "You could look happier for me," she said. "This is everything I've ever wanted." "I am happy," I said. "You finally have exactly what you deserve." She didn't catch the second meaning. She never did. She squeezed my hand instead, rings biting cold against my fingers, and drifted back into the crowd like a queen surveying a kingdom she hadn't paid for yet. Later that night, near the coat check, I heard her talking to one of her old friends from school, voice pitched low and cruel the way it always got after too much champagne. "Honestly, Elena's pathetic," Camille said. "Content with nothing. I used to feel guilty taking things from her. Now I don't even think about it." Her friend laughed, and the sound followed me out into the cold like smoke. That was escalation number 2, delivered without even looking my way. I filed it beside everything else. Some debts you don't collect immediately. You let them accumulate interest. 3 weeks passed in ordinary rhythm. I moved out of the family house and into a small apartment above a bakery 2 towns over, the kind of place with water-stained ceilings and a radiator that clanked at night. The rent was cheap. The bread smell drifted up through the floorboards every morning, warm and simple, nothing like rose perfume or sandalwood cologne. I took a job at a hardware store, stacking paint cans, learning how ordinary hands felt when they weren't holding anything worth stealing. My palms grew rough within days, calluses forming where soft skin used to be. I liked the ache. It felt honest. I made one real friend there, a woman named Priya who ran the register beside mine, sharp-tongued and generous, the kind of person who noticed when you'd gone quiet. She never asked why I flinched at the smell of roses drifting from a nearby flower cart. She just handed me coffee and let the silence sit until it passed. "You've got a look sometimes," Priya said one afternoon, "like you're watching a movie only you can see." "Something like that," I said. "Bad movie?" "Not anymore," I said. "I'm rewriting the ending." She laughed, not understanding, and I let her keep not understanding. Some things you don't explain until they're finished. Meanwhile, I moved through the parts of my plan that required daylight and paperwork. Marcus Ray's office sat on the 4th floor of an old brick building downtown, the elevator groaning the whole way up. His office smelled like leather chairs and old coffee, papers stacked in careful towers along one wall. A clock ticked steadily on his desk, the only sound besides his pen scratching notes. "You understand what you're asking me to build," Marcus said, sliding a folder across the desk toward me. "A case against a man with resources like this takes time. It takes proof that can't be argued with." "I have proof," I said. "Or I will. Give me 30 days. "That's an aggressive timeline." "It's the only timeline I've got," I said. "The merger closes in 26 days. After that, the money moves somewhere none of us can touch." Marcus studied me for a long moment, pen tapping once against the desk. "You've done this before," he said. It wasn't a question. "In a way," I said, and left it there. I spent the next 2 weeks building a paper trail no one else knew existed. I photographed documents Camille left carelessly on the kitchen table during visits home, her signature loose and confident, unaware of what she was signing away. I printed bank statements Julian didn't think anyone would ever request, the printer humming warm under my hands, ink smell sharp in the small copy shop I used instead of my own apartment. I saved screenshots of messages between Julian and men whose names meant nothing to strangers and everything to federal agents. I closed one bank account that still had my name attached from childhood, the one Camille assumed she could still draw against in an emergency. I didn't tell her. I simply let her find out the way people find out things that used to be certain and suddenly aren't. None of it looked like anything yet. Not to Camille. Not to Julian. Not even to Priya, who watched me leave work early some afternoons and never asked where I went. I went to see Mrs. Okafor twice that month, the woman who'd kept my father's books for 20 years and knew things she'd never once said out loud. Her kitchen smelled like cardamom tea, steam curling off 2 chipped mugs between us. "Your father never knew where that first investment came from," she said quietly. I tried to tell him once. He didn't want to hear it. Men like that never do. "I want to hear it," I said. "All of it. Every account, every date, everything you remember." She studied me the way old women study people who've stopped being afraid. "You already know most of it," she said. "Don't you?" I didn't answer. She poured more tea instead, and told me anyway. Back at the house, the cracks were already beginning, quiet and small, the kind Camille wouldn't notice until they widened. Julian came home late twice that week, jaw tight, phone pressed hard against his ear in rooms he thought were empty. Camille asked him once what was wrong. He told her nothing, kissed her forehead, and changed the subject. She believed him. She always believed the version of things that let her keep smiling. I was in the middle of stacking cans at the hardware store one Tuesday afternoon when my phone buzzed against my hip, unfamiliar number, 3 states away. I stepped into the back room to answer. "Miss Marsh," a woman's voice said. "This is Agent Delacroix, Financial Crimes Division. Your attorney passed along some material. We'd like to talk." My pulse didn't spike the way it would have in another life. It simply steadied, the way a chess player's hands steady right before the final move. "I've been expecting your call," I said. She paused, just slightly, on the other end. "Most people say that after we contact them," she said. "Not before." "I'm not most people," I said. "Ask your questions." That call lasted 40 minutes. By the end of it, 3 separate accounts tied to Julian Voss's holding company were flagged for review. Camille had no idea. She was at a dress fitting that same afternoon, laughing about veil lengths, utterly unaware the floor beneath her new life had just begun to crack. The first blow landed 9 days later. Camille called me at 7 in the morning, voice high and thin, panic threading through every word. "Something's wrong with the joint account," she said. "It's frozen. Julian says it's a mistake, but the bank won't tell him anything." "That's strange," I said, keeping my voice flat and even. "You don't sound surprised," Camille said. "Should I be?" There was a long silence on the line. I could hear her breathing, quick and uneven, somewhere in that house that used to be mine. "One of his business partners dropped out of a deal yesterday too," she said, quieter now. "Just walked away. No explanation. Julian's been on the phone all night." I closed my eyes and let myself feel exactly nothing, which after everything, felt like its own kind of victory. "Things happen," I said. "I'm sure it'll sort itself out." It wouldn't. We both knew that eventually, though only one of us knew it yet. 2 nights later, I drove past the old house on my way home from work, headlights sweeping across the gravel drive. Julian's car sat parked at an angle, doors slightly open, like he'd left in a hurry and hadn't bothered coming back for anything. Through the front window, I could see Camille pacing, phone pressed to her ear, free hand pulling at her own hair. I didn't stop. I didn't need to. The trap didn't require my presence to keep tightening. That same week, an envelope arrived at the house addressed to Julian, thick cream paper, a law firm seal pressed into red wax on the back. Camille told me about it later, voice tight with something that hadn't quite become fear yet, just confusion sharpening slowly into dread. "He wouldn't tell me what it said," she said. "He just went white and locked himself in his study." "Maybe you should ask him directly," I said. "I did," she said. "He told me not to worry about it." That's when people should worry the most, I thought, though I didn't say it out loud. I saw Julie and myself 3 days after that, at a dinner Camille insisted I attend, some last attempt to prove her happy life was still intact. He looked thinner than the man who'd first stepped out of that black car, jaw shadowed with stubble he usually kept clean, sandalwood cologne worn thin under stress sweat instead. "Elena," he said, shaking my hand a beat too long. "You've been quiet lately." "I've been busy," I said. "Building something." "Anything interesting?" "Very," I said, and smiled at him the exact way he used to smile at everyone else. Something shifted behind his eyes, sharp and wary. The way a man looks when he suspects a door he thought was locked has quietly swung open behind him. He didn't say anything else to me that night. He watched me instead, across the table. Through 2 courses and a bottle of wine he barely touched. Camille noticed nothing. She talked about wedding venues, seating charts, flower arrangements, oblivious to the current running silently beneath her own dinner table. Later that night, walking to my car, I caught the edge of Camille's rose perfume drifting from an open window above. And for one sharp second, I was back on those marble stairs again, blood pooling warm beneath my skull, her shoes standing perfectly still at the top. I gripped the car door until the memory passed, knuckles white, breath shallow. It always came back like that. Sudden. Uninvited. Precise. I drove home in silence, radio off, hands steady on the wheel despite everything. Somewhere behind me, in a house full of flowers and fear, Camille was still telling herself everything would be fine. She had exactly 19 days left to keep believing that. The worst of it came 6 days later, at a lunch Camille had planned for weeks, some public display meant to celebrate the wedding date. She chose a restaurant downtown, white tablecloths, waiters who knew her by name. She invited old family friends, people who had known our mother, people who still remembered me as something other than an afterthought. I almost didn't go. I went anyway, because I needed to watch this particular scene play out with my own eyes. Camille stood halfway through the meal, glass raised, cheeks pink with wine and attention. "I want to thank my sister," she said, loud enough for the whole table to hear. "Elena taught me something important. Sometimes the people who love you the least are the ones who give you the most." The table laughed, unaware of the blade hidden inside the joke. I kept my face perfectly still. "She gave up everything without a fight," Camille continued, eyes bright and cruel. "Some people just aren't built to hold on to what matters. I suppose that's why some of us end up with everything, and some of us end up with nothing at all." Someone at the table laughed again, uncertain this time, glancing toward me to see how I'd react. I smiled instead, slow and easy, like a woman who'd already read the last page of this particular book. "You're right," I said. "I'm not built to hold on to things that were never really mine to keep." Camille's smile faltered, just slightly, unsure if she'd been complimented or cut. I let her wonder. That was escalation number 4, delivered in public, dressed up as a toast, meant to humiliate me in front of everyone who still remembered my mother's name. It was also, without her realizing it, the last mistake she'd get to make from a position of comfort. I left the restaurant 20 minutes later, and the smell of her perfume followed me out the door, thick and sweet in the summer air. My stomach turned the way it always did. Somewhere behind my ribs. An old memory surfaced without permission. Camille's voice. Calm and flat. Saying something to Julian the night I died. Words I'd never quite been able to hear clearly until now. I stopped on the sidewalk, breath catching, the past bleeding into the present for one unbearable second. Then it passed, the way it always did. And I kept walking. That night, my phone rang past midnight, a number I hadn't expected to hear from yet in this life. I recognized it instantly, a name that had meant almost nothing to me the first time around, and everything to me now. "It's David," the voice said, quiet and careful. "David Okafor. My mother said you'd been asking questions." David had worked alongside Julian years ago, in my old life, before disappearing from every version of the story I remembered. I'd never known why he left, or what he knew. I only remembered his name on a witness list that surfaced 2 months after I died, a list nobody ever got to use. "I remember your name," I said carefully. "I didn't expect to hear from you this early." "I left Voss Capital 18 months ago," David said. "I saw things I couldn't explain to myself anymore. Your family's accountant said you might actually listen, instead of looking the other way like everyone else did." "I'm listening," I said. "I have records," he said. Internal ones. The kind that don't show up in public filings. If you're building a case, you're going to need someone who was inside the room. I sat up straighter in the dark, pulse quickening for the first time in weeks. This wasn't a piece I'd planned for. This was a piece I hadn't even known existed, dropped into my hands at exactly the moment I needed it most. "Where do we meet?" I asked. "Somewhere no one will recognize either of us," he said. "I'll send you an address tomorrow." I hung up and sat in the dark a long while, turning the shape of this new information over in my mind. In my old life, David Okafor's testimony had come too late to matter, buried in a case that closed before it ever really opened. This time, it was arriving early, unprompted, exactly when the trap needed one more piece to hold its full weight. I still didn't know everything he had. I only knew it would matter more than almost anything else I'd gathered so far. Marcus called 2 days later, voice tight with something close to excitement, an emotion I'd never heard from him before. "The evidence you brought in last week," he said. "Combined with what came in from a new source overnight, Elena, this isn't just a financial case anymore. This is racketeering. This is federal." "How long until you can move?" I asked. "Faster than I expected," he said. "Days, not weeks. Days." The word settled into my chest like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward toward everything that came next. I didn't tell Camille any of it. I didn't tell Priya, or Mrs. Okafor, or anyone who might accidentally let something slip before it was time. I simply kept working, kept smiling at family dinners, kept letting Camille believe her wedding date was the only clock running in either of our lives. She had no idea a second countdown had just started, running faster than the first, aimed directly at the ground beneath her feet. 19 days became 12. 12 became 7. Somewhere in that stretch of ordinary mornings and quiet evenings, I felt something shift in the air around that house, subtle at first, then unmistakable, the particular silence that settles right before something finally breaks. I didn't know yet exactly how the final blow would land, or which piece would fall first. I only knew it was already moving. Quietly. Inevitably. The way water finds every crack in a foundation no one thought to check. Something else was moving too, something I hadn't fully planned for, a name from my old life that had just resurfaced exactly when I needed it most. That would change everything that came next. The 7th day arrived, gray and still, clouds pressing low over the whole town. The merger's final window closed at midnight. Julian's wedding to Camille was scheduled for the following week. Banners already printed. Flowers already ordered. The whole fragile architecture of her happiness standing on a foundation about to give way completely. I met David Okafor that morning in the back booth of a diner 2 towns over. Coffee steam curling between us, vinyl seats cracked and cold. He slid a thick folder across the table without a word. "Everything's here," he said. "Wire transfers. Shell companies. Recordings of Julian discussing the arrangement with the men funding it. I kept copies for 18 months, waiting for someone who'd actually use them." I opened the folder slowly, flipping through pages I already half remembered from another life, except this time they were early, complete, and mine to use before it was too late. "You're sure about this?" I said. "Once this moves, there's no taking it back." "I've been sure for a year and a half," David said. "I just needed someone brave enough to light the match." I closed the folder and looked up at him. "Then let's burn it down." By noon, Marcus filed the lawsuit. By 1, copies of the evidence sat in the inbox of 3 separate journalists who owed him favors from cases nobody remembered anymore. By 2, Agent Delacroix's team executed a warrant on the offices of Voss Capital, federal plates lining the street outside like a slow, deliberate procession. I wasn't there to see it happen. I didn't need to be. I felt it anyway. The way you feel a storm breaks somewhere over the horizon, thunder rolling in long before the rain arrives. Camille called me at 3:15, voice shredded with panic I'd never heard from her before. "There are people at the office," she said. "Federal agents. They're taking boxes out of Julian's building." "What is happening, Elena?" "I don't know," I said. "You should ask Julian." "I can't reach him," she said. "His phone goes straight to voicemail." "Elena, please, if you know something." "I told you a long time ago," I said, "to ask questions before you signed anything." You didn't want to hear it then, either. The line went quiet except for her breathing, ragged and uneven. By 4 o'clock, the story broke online, headline after headline stacking up like dominoes finally allowed to fall. Investment fraud. Money laundering. Federal investigation. Camille's name appeared in 2 of them, listed as a business partner, her photograph pulled from an old charity gala, smiling and radiant beside a man now described as a person of interest. Marcus stood on the courthouse steps that same afternoon, microphones crowding close, cameras flashing white against the gray sky. I watched the footage later on a small television propped behind the hardware store counter, Priya leaning beside me, arms crossed. My client provided documentation showing a pattern of deliberate fraud, Marcus said, voice steady under the noise. This office will pursue every available remedy, civil and criminal, on her behalf. A reporter shouted a question I couldn't fully hear. Marcus answered anyway, calm, unhurried, exactly the way I'd hoped he would. She trusted her family, he said. That trust was exploited for profit. That ends today. Priya glanced sideways at me, something curious flickering behind her eyes. Family, she repeated. You've never mentioned family. I don't anymore. I said. And left it there. She didn't push. She just handed me a coffee, the way she always did, and let the television keep talking for both of us. By 5, the wedding venue called to cancel, their number blocked before Camille could even answer. By 6, one of Julian's remaining business partners issued a public statement distancing himself entirely, calling the arrangement a mistake he deeply regretted trusting. By 7, the joint bank account Camille still thought might reopen was formally frozen under court order, along with 3 others linked to Julian's holding company. The story spread faster than even I expected. By 8, strangers were commenting under Camille's old photos, the charity gala picture shared thousands of times within a single hour. People she'd never met were calling her complicit. People she'd grown up with were calling her a fool. A few, the cruelest ones, were calling her exactly what she'd once called me. I didn't post anything myself. I didn't need to. The truth was already loud enough on its own. Each hour brought another collapse, smaller pieces breaking off a structure that had never been stable to begin with. I watched it happen from my apartment, radiator clanking, bread smell drifting up from the bakery below, calm in a way I hadn't been calm in either lifetime. The reward Camille had fought so hard to win was detonating from the inside, exactly the way I'd known it would since the morning it was handed to her. And now my own attack was landing on top of it, faster and harder than anything the trap alone could have managed. Double collapse. Exactly as planned. I felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't realized was still clenched. Satisfaction. Sharp and clean. But underneath it, something else stirred too, a thin thread of unease, quiet and persistent, refusing to fully let go. Camille showed up at my apartment just past 9 that night. Mascara streaked down both cheeks, hair pulled loose from its careful curls. Her rose perfume had faded into something sourer, sweat, and desperation underneath. For the first time since I'd woken up in this life, the scent didn't make my stomach turn. It just made her look small. I barely recognized her standing in my doorway. The Camille from the engagement party, glowing and untouchable, had disappeared somewhere between the courthouse steps and this hallway. Her eyes were swollen and rimmed red. Her dress, the same expensive cut she always wore, hung wrinkled and slightly torn at one shoulder. Her hands trembled when she reached for the doorframe to steady herself. "Can I come in?" she asked, voice small in a way I'd never once heard from her. I stepped aside and let her pass. "You have to help me," she said, voice cracking. "They froze everything. Julian's gone, Elena, he's just gone, no one will tell me anything." "I can't help you," I said. "I never could. Not with this." "You knew," she said suddenly, eyes narrowing through the tears. "Didn't you? You knew this whole time." I studied her for a long moment, letting the silence stretch until it became its own kind of answer. "I knew," I said, "the moment you signed those papers." Camille stared at me like I'd struck her. "Then why didn't you stop me?" "Because you never would have listened," I said. "You never listened to anything that didn't come wrapped in a compliment." She sank onto the edge of my kitchen chair, hands shaking, the diamond ring on her finger catching the light with a coldness it hadn't had a week ago. Her hands were dry now, no lotion, no manicure appointments left to keep them soft. Just dirt under 2 broken nails from God knew what. "What did you do?" she said quietly. "What exactly did you do?" I sat across from her, hands steady on the table between us. "I gave you something you wanted," I said. "You took it without checking what was inside. Then, while it collapsed on its own, I made sure nothing was left standing to catch you when it did." "You planned this," she whispered. "From the beginning." "From before the beginning," I said. "You just weren't paying attention." Her face crumpled, something between rage and grief passing over it too fast to settle into either one. "Why?" she said. "Why would you do this to me?" I thought about the marble stairs. The chandelier spinning slow above me. Her shoes, standing perfectly still while I bled out beneath her. "Because you did it to me first," I said. "In a life you don't remember living." Camille's mouth opened, then closed again, no words left to fill the space. She didn't understand, and I didn't explain further. Some truths don't need context to land. They only need time to arrive. "You're lying," she said finally, though her voice had no conviction left in it. "This is insane. You're talking about some life I never lived." "I know it sounds insane," I said. "I don't need you to believe me. I only needed you to sign the papers." "You used me," she said. "You planned every single moment, down to the smile you gave me that morning at the kitchen table." "Yes," I said simply. "I did." She flinched at how easily I admitted it, like the honesty itself was another kind of wound. Her hands twisted together in her lap, knuckles pale, the diamond ring loose now on a finger that had lost weight in a matter of hours. "What happens to me now?" she asked. Quieter than I'd ever heard her. "That depends entirely on you," I said. "Whether you finally start asking questions before you take what's offered." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I have," I said. "I'm done handing you anything else." She left 20 minutes later, alone, into a night that had nowhere warm waiting for her anymore. I sat at my table long after she'd gone, listening to the radiator tick and cool, letting the last pieces settle into place. In 3 days, Julian would be formally charged, his assets seized entirely, his name attached permanently to a case that would make headlines for months. In 3 days, Camille would lose the house, the wedding, every version of the life she thought she'd secured for good. The plan I'd carried since the moment I woke up gasping in a bed I remembered dying far away from it had worked exactly the way I'd built it to work. Not through luck. Not through mercy. Through 11 days of quiet phone calls, printed documents, and one carefully handed gift disguised as generosity. Camille had asked me why. I hadn't told her everything. I hadn't told her that David Okafor's evidence, the piece that finally broke the case wide open, existed only because I'd reached out to his mother the very first week I woke up in this life, long before Julian's car ever came up our gravel drive. I hadn't told her that Marcus Reyes had been retained before Julian even had a name in either of our lives. I hadn't told her that every single step, from the moment I said take my share, had been placed with the precision of someone who had already lived through every version of losing. She thought she'd watched a trap spring shut around her by accident. She had no idea she'd been walking through a maze I'd built from memory, every wall already mapped, every exit already sealed, long before she took her first step inside it. That was the part she would never understand. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. I learned later, through Marcus, exactly what happened to Julian that same night. Agents found him at a private airfield 2 hours south, boarding pass in hand, a single suitcase packed with cash and nothing else. He didn't resist when they stopped him. He simply stood there, sandalwood cologne worn thin under airport fluorescence, watching his entire carefully built life end in a room with gray carpet and no windows. "He asked about you," Marcus told me over the phone, voice careful. Before they took him in, he asked how someone he'd never really noticed had taken apart everything he'd spent years building. "What did you tell him?" I asked. "I told him the truth," Marcus said. "That he underestimated the wrong sister." I said nothing for a moment, letting that sentence settle somewhere warm behind my ribs. "There's something else," Marcus added. "The men behind Voss Capital, the ones actually funding the operation. They're not pleased. Word is they consider Julian a liability now. A loose thread. That's not my concern, I said. It might become one, Marcus said. Watch yourself, Elena. Men like that don't like being exposed. They like it even less when they can't find who exposed them. I thanked him and hung up, and sat with that warning a while, turning it over carefully. In my old life, I never lived long enough to learn what came after exposure. This time, I intended to survive long enough to find out. Outside my window, rain began to fall, soft against the glass, steady and unhurried. Somewhere across town, in a house no longer hers, Camille was learning exactly how far a person could fall in a single day. I closed my eyes and let the sound of the rain replace every other sound in my memory, the crystal chandelier, the click of her heels, the copper taste of blood I hadn't tasted yet in this life, and never intended to taste again. For the first time since I'd woken up, the past finally felt like it was staying in the past, right where it belonged. My hands didn't shake anymore when I thought about that staircase. My chest didn't tighten at the sound of heels on hardwood. Something in me had finally gone quiet, the way a house goes quiet after a storm passes through it completely. But somewhere south of town, in a room with gray carpet and no windows, a different kind of clock had just started ticking. And this time, I wasn't the one who'd started it. The gray sedan appeared outside my apartment 2 nights later, parked at the curb, engine idling low in the dark. I recognized it instantly. I'd seen it once before, months earlier, watching our old house from the end of the gravel drive. I walked straight up to the driver's side and knocked on the window. It rolled down slowly. The man inside was older than I expected, gray at the temples, a face carved from patience rather than menace. "You've been watching me for months," I said. "I think it's time you told me why." "Your father hired me," he said. "Years ago, before you were born into this particular timeline. A standing arrangement, renewed quietly every year since. Protection, in case anything ever happened to either daughter." I stared at him, pieces sliding into place I hadn't expected to find. "He never told me," I said. "He never told either of you," the man said. "He didn't want you living afraid. He just wanted someone watching, in case the day ever came." "And Julian's people," I said. "The ones Marcus warned me about." "Handled," the man said simply. Quietly. Before they got close enough to matter. I stood there a long moment, rain starting to fall again, cold against my shoulders. My father, dead in every version of this story I'd ever lived, had still found a way to protect me from beyond it. I hadn't planned for that. I hadn't remembered it, because in my old life, I never lived long enough to learn it existed. "Thank you," I said quietly. He nodded once, rolled the window back up, and drove away into the wet dark. I never saw the car again. I confronted Camille one final time, 3 weeks later, in a small visiting room at the county courthouse. She'd lost weight. Her hair had grown out at the roots, dark against faded blonde, no money left for upkeep of any kind. She wore a plain gray sweater, nothing like silk, nothing like diamonds. The room smelled like old coffee and disinfectant, fluorescent light humming overhead. A guard stood by the door, arms crossed, watching without watching. Camille's hands trembled slightly against the metal table, no rings left on any finger now. "They're offering me a deal," she said, hands folded tight on the table between us. "If I testify against Julian. Against the whole operation." "You should take it," I said. "I didn't know," she said, voice cracking. "I swear to you, Elena, I didn't know what he was involved in." "You didn't want to know," I said. "There's a difference. You never once asked a question that might have slowed down what you wanted." She flinched, but didn't argue. Something in her had finally stopped fighting the truth. "Everyone's turned on me," she said quietly. "Friends. Reporters. People who used to beg for invitations to my parties. Even Mom's old friends won't answer my calls anymore." "That happens," I said, "when the truth finally catches up to the version of yourself you were selling." "You could have warned me," she said, something almost pleading in her voice now. "Before any of it started. One word, Elena. That's all it would have taken." "I did warn you," I said. "The day the papers arrived, I told you to ask questions. You laughed at me instead." Her jaw tightened, memory surfacing behind her eyes, the two of us on that porch months ago, sun going down orange behind the fields. I thought you were being dramatic, she admitted. I thought you were jealous. I know, I said. That was always the problem. You mistook every warning for envy. Will you forgive me? She asked. For everything. For all of it. I looked at her for a long moment, weighing the question honestly, the way I hadn't let myself weigh anything in months. No, I said. I won't. Her face crumpled, tears sliding silent down cheeks that used to be perfect. I felt nothing shift inside me watching it happen. No triumph. No cruelty. Just a clean, quiet certainty that this was simply the truth, and the truth didn't need softening to be complete. I'm not here for forgiveness, I said. I'm here to tell you something you still don't understand. Everything that happened, giving up my share, watching you take Julian, watching you sign every paper without reading a single line, none of it was an accident. I planned it. All of it. Starting the morning I woke up in a bed I remembered dying in 3 years from now. Camille's eyes widened, something between disbelief and dawning horror crossing her face. That's not possible, she whispered. I know how it sounds, I said. I don't need you to believe it. I only needed you to keep being exactly who you've always been. You never disappointed me once. How? Camille said, voice barely a whisper now. How did I die? In this life, you claim I already caused. I hesitated, just for a moment, letting the marble stairs rise up one final time behind my eyes. You'll never need to know that, I said. Because this time, it isn't going to happen. She had nothing left to say to that. I stood, chair scraping quiet against the floor, and walked toward the door without looking back. Elena, she called after me, voice breaking. Wait. I paused, hand on the frame, but didn't turn around. I loved you once, she said. Before all of this. Didn't I? I thought about that question longer than I expected to. Maybe. I said. In whatever way you were capable of loving anyone. I walked out and didn't look back again. I sold the last of my father's old shares 3 months later, quietly, to a buyer who had no idea what history came attached to the paperwork. I gave half the money to David Okafor, who used it to start over somewhere far from Voss Capital's ruins. I gave a smaller portion to Mrs. Okafor, who cried when I handed her the check, and told me my mother would have been proud, whether or not I believed in prouder versions of ghosts. I kept the rest for myself. Not much. Enough. Marcus called one last time that autumn, voice lighter than I'd ever heard it. Julian pled guilty, he said. Full cooperation, in exchange for a reduced sentence. Camille testified against him 3 days ago. It's over. Elena. All of it. Thank you, I said. For believing me, back when I first walked into your office with nothing but a folder and a deadline. You didn't give me much choice, Marcus said, something like warmth in his voice. You walked in like you'd already won. Turns out you had. I hung up and sat with that for a long while, letting the weight of it finally settle somewhere I could set it down. I moved further out of town that spring, to a small piece of land with a garden already half wild, tomatoes growing crooked along a fence nobody had trimmed in years. Priya visited on weekends sometimes, bringing bread from the bakery, laughing at how badly I still burned toast despite everything I'd survived. I never told her the full truth. Some things don't need telling to be understood. On quiet mornings, I sat on the porch and let the sun warm my hands, dirt still under my fingernails from planting something new. The air smelled like turned earth and cut grass, nothing like roses, nothing like sandalwood, nothing like anything that used to hurt. The birds here sang early, before the sun fully cleared the tree line. I'd sit with a cup of coffee going cold in my hands, listening, feeling the warmth settle deeper into my bones each morning than it had the one before. Somewhere out there, Camille was rebuilding a smaller life from the wreckage of a larger one. Julian was somewhere behind bars, learning what it meant to be the one exposed instead of the one exposing. Neither of them occupied much space in my mind anymore. I'd stopped checking the news for updates weeks ago. I didn't need triumph. I'd already had it, briefly, sharp and satisfying, on the night everything collapsed at once. What I needed now was quieter than that. Just sunlight. Just wind moving soft through unmowed grass. Just birds calling somewhere past the fence line, ordinary and unbothered by anything that had happened before them. I closed my eyes and let it hold me. This life I'd fought so hard and so quietly to rebuild. Some people spend their second chance seeking revenge. I spent mine learning the difference between revenge and justice, and choosing, finally, to walk away once the difference stopped mattering. If you were me, would you have saved her, or walked away? Tell me in the comments. Where are you watching from?